Hello, folks. This is Race Matters, and I am the co-host, Eddie Carson, joined by my co-host, Professor Jeffrey Baker. And we're kind of leaning in here like we do every week. One of the things we aim to do here at Race Matters is we like to delve into the nomenclature of race, class, gender, culture, and all the things that seemingly divide us, but yet creating conversations with great guests that you'll kind of unite and unify us in many ways. We're coming to you from WJOP 96.3, Newburyport, Massachusetts, and you can find Race Matters also on SoundCloud and YouTube.
Eddie Carson, thank you so much. I'm very happy to welcome my friend to our show today. This is Professor Jennifer Coe. She is an associate professor at Law School of Law. She is the co-director of the Newt Bar Institute for Law, Religion, and Ethics. She is also my great friend, colleague, counterpart, co-conspirator, fellow traveler, and in lots of work and lots of projects along the way. Professor Coe is an expert in immigration law. She's been an immigration practitioner. She's an immigration scholar. She's a highly credentialed attorney and also a great person of faith. And Jennifer, it's very good to have you on our show today.
It's so good to be here. Thank you both for having me.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you've gotten started in your work, especially around being an immigration attorney and then immigration scholar, and a little bit what motivates you toward this vocation in your professional life?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on how far we want to go back. But if we go back to the very beginning, I think for me, growing up as one of the only Asian Americans in upstate New York as a child, I just often was confronted with this question of who is really an American. And like many other people from immigrant backgrounds, as a child was asked that question, where are you from? Too many times. And like many others, I mean, racism didn't define my childhood, but it was certainly part of it. And so like the kind of microaggression type slurs and questions were pretty constant. They were just sort of part of what it meant to be. And so as a result, I think I was really intrigued with those questions, like, well, who really is an American? And for me, they were kind of exacerbated because after being born in the United States and growing up in primarily white communities in the Northeast, my parents actually moved with me back to Korea when I was in middle school. My Korean language skills were really limited at the time. I very much identified as not native Korean. And so it sort of compounded these questions, led me to being really interested in questions of civil rights, of Asian American history, of immigration history. But I mean, I have to say, like, immigration history, Asian American history are very much linked to just a question of race in the United States, that you cannot ignore the long history of Black Americans, of Native Americans. It's all connected. I went to law school with an interest in international human rights. That brought me back again to immigration. In many ways, immigration is the portal through which human rights work is done in the United States. And it's also the portal through which these questions of who is an American are partially formed. Not entirely, but like how we as a country move people forcibly and who we choose to allow in, and then what kind of membership rights we attach to them. Like, those are fundamental questions in immigration. They're also fundamental questions, again, in the histories of Indigenous people. They're fundamental questions around people whose migration has been forced and who have been forced into labor. So those are kind of like the set of questions that have motivated a lot of my work so far. I think that, you know, an initial interest doesn't always develop into a career of pursuit. But I think for me, as I continued to journey through law, I was intrigued, and I continue to be intrigued by this question of how immigration law develops in a way that departs from generally accepted norms about how law works, how the rule of law works, how the Constitution works, how we kind of allow for legal structures to develop in ways that might normally be seen as like an aberration of American values. And so it's just been interesting. I mean, and not just like academically interesting, but has also brought high human stakes and to me also taught me things about community and family and love and what matters. And so I guess those are just like all the different reasons why I do what I do.
It's all such good stuff, and it's in a moment right now, and maybe this moment is not specific to our moment or unique in American history, but it is a heightened moment right now of trying to understand how immigration law intersects with all of those things that you were just talking about, and how it can be highly technical and highly administrative to some extent, but it really gets to the core values of who we are as a country.
Mhm.
And when an executive can take extreme action within that somewhat ambiguous area of law and American culture, the upheaval can be extraordinary.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was really well put.
No. You and I talked very briefly about an essay that you have coming out, and I think that it would be worthwhile to mention it and have you explain it a little bit, because I think it can be an entree into a lot of these conversations that we'll want to have and follow up questions. Please tell us about this essay, "Deportation After Death by Incarceration: A Right to Redemption," which is an expression of what you've described to me as participatory law scholarship. So perhaps tell us a little bit about participatory scholarship, and then let's hear about the essay.
Yeah, so participatory law scholarship is a genre of legal scholarship in which academics partner with co-authors who have been directly impacted by law and the legal systems that they jointly write about. The person who really pioneered and developed this area is Rachel Lopez, who's a law professor at Temple University, a friend and colleague. And she wrote a piece together with two individuals, Terrell Carter and Gani Songster, several years ago, which was published in the Northwestern Law Review, called Redeeming Justice. Her co-authors at the time of writing, one was serving a life sentence without parole, also known as death by incarceration, and another co-author had been released. And they write about so in many ways actually I'm deeply indebted to Professor Lopez both for um, sort of developing this genre of writing called participatory law scholarship, because in a follow-on piece, she then writes more about some of the characteristics and contributions of what it means for academics to not just write the stories of people whose lives have been impacted by law and legal systems, but to actually partner as co-authors and as equal voices in the production of legal scholarship. But substantively, what I'm writing about with a colleague is also related to that piece, because that piece talked about the concept of redemption, the idea that all people are capable of change, the idea that law could and should account for people's capacity to change, to forgive and be forgiven, as they say, to transform and be transformed. And they wrote that piece in the context of specifically the criminal system and death by incarceration sentences. Um, the piece that I'm working on is a short essay. It'll be published in the Kentucky Law Journal next year. And I co-author with an individual who himself once served a sentence of death by incarceration. As he puts it in his words, he was sentenced to die in prison, and that was his future and his fate. Um, and through and because of his own personal story of transformation, he talks in the essay about how the experience of sort of what led to the choices that caused him to receive this sentence. He describes the dog training program that he participated in prison, the educational program. He talks about his more direct, just spiritual encounters with God. And we share a faith in Christianity. And we argue in the essay that not just criminal law, but immigration law should also incorporate a right to redemption. So my co-author is someone whose sentence was commuted, that because of his um, personal journey of transformation, he was released from this sentence. He was then immediately transferred to ICE detention during COVID through community support and extensive advocacy. He was released and is now kind of facing the realities of current immigration policy, which include, I think not just deportation, but retaliatory deportation, deportation in the form of sending people to third countries that where the risk of uh, harm and death and torture are significant realities. Um, so at any rate, it's been a privilege to partner with my co-author in writing this piece because, at the end of the day, there's a lot of debate over immigration. I realize people have vastly different views. It is controversial. I may not reflect the majority of American views. And in fact, if there's one thing that almost anyone tends to agree on, it is that people with who have committed serious crimes who are not citizens should be deported. It's almost like sort of an unquestioned common sense value that binds people of all parts of the political spectrum. Um, and I think in this essay, we're trying to just simply just not to say that that may not be the proper outcome for some people, but that we really want to ask that question, is that the outcome that must follow for all? And are we capable of seeing the humanity of some, despite whatever, I don't mean to say whatever, despite the very real harms uh, that their past lives may have caused. So that's just a little glimpse of it. It's very much rooted ultimately, I think, in our shared faith and in our deep conviction that redemption is not just a theoretical concept, but that it is real. And it's something that, informs what it means to be human.
Mm. My friend, I was fascinated and listening to you and kind of reading your background and hearing this narrative. I'm a big fan of storytelling, and I do believe that stories, right, can bridge a lot of gaps, particularly if people want to lean in and listen to those differences. And of course, that's one of the things that I'm hearing here too. And I think about really your own academic work as a legal scholar, your work when it comes to immigration, and your own faith background that's there. I saw that you do spend time communicating with a lot of different faith-based populations and groups along the way. What has been some of the maybe the pushback you've received from your work regarding thinking about redemption and immigration from folks that may not be able to see such narrative and hear such stories that are important for us to move forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. What's funny and maybe this is a sign of the times, or maybe it's my own shortcoming. Um, I don't know that I have received the kind of direct pushback and direct, outright disagreement and debate over some of the things that I'm talking about. I mean, I've sort of there's I guess apart from the kind of hate mail type communications. Um,
Oh, just that.
yeah. So like, but you know what I mean? Like the venues in which to really engage with some of those harder questions, I think has been more limited. And again, this really, I'll admit that could just be my own, shortcoming, blind spot. I think a lot of the time when I've spoken to a faith audience, there has been they have been the kinds of audiences that have, on a values level, been open
Hmm.
to thinking about how can we do immigration differently, and who have um, really wanted more information on the legal side as to sort of how we have gotten here. I should say also, like this essay that I described is something that has not yet been published. It's still in formation, so that's not something that I've yet to. It's possible that that may elicit like a much stronger reaction um, than I've received in the past. Um,
At the
yeah.
risk of erecting a straw man, which I really don't want to do, but being able to anticipate some of the potential objections to some of these
Hmm.
things, you talked
Hmm.
about the basic common sense, like just the received narrative that
Hmm.
people who have been convicted of crimes, if they're eligible to be deported, should be.
Yeah.
Um, what's your best argument against that? You root that in a concept of redemption,
Sure.
which as people of faith or conscience we can understand. Sure, redemption is a good thing, but let's talk about the redemption as it functions in law and policy. What's your response to someone who says no, that's just good public policy for the sake of the nation and public safety? Why shouldn't that be the default position?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess I would say, and I don't know if this is the best argument per se, but I think it would be, let's provide a space in which to consider the person's experience and qualities. And it may not be the case that everybody, for example, should be able to stay, right? But let's not draw these technical rules and create these categories that must be followed 100% of the time, even if those are often the defaults. But in order to do that in a meaningful way that is not deeply politicized and set up sort of to have an automatic answer, I do think that requires grasping with some of the like kind of the issues of the heart and the just like underlying ideas, like the lofty principles. Um, the problem, I guess, is there are a couple of problems. One is not just like the impact on those who actually fall into the category. And again, there are sort of like different considerations. It's sort of like, do we measure a person only by their past deeds? What about the fact that my co-author came to the United States when he was 6 years old, right? What about the fact that he's lived in the country now for half a century? What about the fact that, it was from the Vietnam War that one's family came, right? Sort of like, well, to what extent can we at least make room for that? But the other piece is that once we start drawing these rigid categories, it's very easy to expand those categories. So what you see with there's a lot of rhetoric about we're deporting the worst of the worst. But precisely who the worst of the worst is has grown larger and larger and larger in a very small space of time. I mean, that's not like a particular new thing. We've always been very like fuzzy in terms of drawing distinctions around migration and crime and when is someone a criminal, um, right? And when does someone's movement across the border render them a criminal. But we're seeing more and more of that, and a lot of it is taking place under the banner of the worst language in order to increasingly justify people even with lawful status or right or people who have crossed a border um, as being sort of increasingly placed within that category. So I guess those are just a couple of quick
No, no,
responses.
You no, go ahead, Jeff.
no. You go ahead, Carson.
Interesting. So, here's something that I'm really excited to ask you about, and I'm curious to get your take on this. And so, one of the things I always remind folks, right, and we all know this, the topic and the history of immigration within this country it's gone on for a long, long, long time, and we can go back to even the Jefferson Adams administration when it really came to fruition, and we can just keep tracking the laws and the attitudes and everything too. So, it's nothing new.
Mhm.
That being the case, do you have a sense, though, that there's been somewhat of a radical paradigm shift when it comes to immigration, primarily due to the browning, the colorization of America, in a sense of white anxiety about,
Mhm.
well, who can and who cannot come, oftentimes based off pigmentation, or we decide who we invite in as the host versus the guest mentality that's there?
Yeah, I mean, I, I, I couldn't agree with you more on the point about just the history and how this question of um, migration and race and membership, and again, sort of like who counts as American, has always been looming, like how violence has been used to enforce those boundaries. It's always been there. Um, I think it's tricky on a couple of different fronts. Um, and I guess I'm almost like I'm hesitating a little bit. I'm finding myself like grasping for the right words here because, I want to say yes to all of that. On the other hand, we are as a country, and this is, I think, related, right, to what you mentioned. Um, it has become so difficult to talk about race in certain like sectors of society very quickly, right? And you can really kind of point this to all kinds of factors and, kind of right, progress and backlash and progress and backlash. Um, and the backlash has been so swift when you think about sort of where we were in terms of our willingness to confront some of the past in, for example, 2020 versus um, where we are now. So, um, yes. And I think, and it's kind of like a chicken and an egg thing where some of the anxiety is related to racial anxiety, and yet at the same time, a lot of the implementation of current policy is like realigning our society according to racial categories. So by that I mean like there's the overall sentiment, right? The, sort of exposure to like the rhetoric that demonizes immigrants, et cetera, it sort of plays on pre-existing anxiety. But then what you have is, for example, like decisions that come out that talk about the use of race and making immigration arrests and whether that's permissible. You see the Supreme Court blessing that. So we then see that like evolving into actually like, primarily and not exclusively, but like lots of Latina citizens being picked up by immigration, people being actually, detained wrongfully, incorrectly, so much by racial lines. And so we see those categories just like sort of calcifying in all kinds of ugly ways. And I guess the reason though why I still hesitate is that it's so hard and has become unproductive in a lot of quarters where once you start injecting race into the conversation about immigration, people who do have legitimate concerns and questions, um, you know, there's this sort of underlying narrative that sort of anyone who has concerns about immigration gets, pegged as a racist. And that's, I guess, a line that I've been trying to be thoughtful about and tread somewhat carefully because that's not at all what I want to imply either.
Please, please say no. I just want to say, please say a little bit more about that maybe for our audience, but mostly just for me, because I think it's very hard to do what you just described, and I'd like to hear you say a little bit more about how you attempt it, because we don't have anything in this in our current era called something like the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? We're not talking
Hmm.
about Jim Crow laws. We're not talking about segregation. We live in an age where at least our laws are face, on their face racially neutral. Um, but yet we see all of the realities that you just said. I mean, the president this day, or at least yesterday, railing about Somali
Hmm.
communities in Minnesota,
Hmm.
and we hear Justice Kavanaugh's justification of being able to use race as a factor, because he would say, kind
Right.
of course it is.
Right.
Yeah.
And because this is just the numeric reality of who we're doing it. So as you try to walk that fine line, as you say, coach us a little bit. Think about how you would advise folks who are looking for justice for humans who are immigrants while walking that line of trying not to alienate because of talking about race, which is manifestly part of the conversation.
Yeah, well, I was kind of hoping that you guys could help me figure that out as well, because it's a question that I'm still teasing through. I mean, I guess there's, like that, there's a time for everything. Um, there
Yeah,
are times. Yeah, go
yeah, no,
ahead.
I mean, into that, and I haven't done any of the research and don't do anything near the work you're doing, anything like that. I am a big data person. I believe in the citations. I believe in the data and
Hmm.
all that. And to answer that, I'd be curious about, you know, where, when it comes to immigrations, where's the most contentious element regarding what countries? Are we talking about countries where predominantly people maybe because of their religious background that can be kind of coincided with race? Or is it a country, for example, where a lot of people are people of color coming in versus that where people are not so much people of color coming in? And who do we side? How do we side? Because there are no comprehensive immigration laws. I mean, oftentimes I feel like people get in a room and it becomes political and they decide. But to Professor Baker's point, though, it seems difficult, and I applaud you, my friend, to be able to take the formula of race off the table because it feels so ubiquitous to everything, even that anxiety that's here.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't exactly advocate taking it off the table. I think it's really important to be pretty clear about, for example, like a lot of the white supremacist views that are coming out of the government at some of the highest levels these days, and how, like, just a lot of these policies are, just very clearly. I just thinking about, for example, like refugee admissions and the explicit favoring of white South Africans and the kind of language that's been used in so many
Wait,
ways to describe other countries. Yeah, oh, go ahead.
no, that's a perfect point. How did I forget
Hmm.
about that example right there? White South
Hmm.
Africans. I mean, it's huge
Yeah,
right there too, though. Uh,
yeah,
I don't. I mean, you've given me a lot to chew on as we think about this. But I mean, I
yeah.
will say I'm a person who thinks about race in a way, maybe even an influenced by my own biases, where I do believe an overwhelming number of decisions are predicated on
Hmm.
race.
Yes. Yeah, no, and I would tend to agree as well. And that's why I like kind of tracing back through the history, recognizing that race has always been a part of our country and decision making. And that then the consequences of those decisions have then gone on to reinforce whatever systems and structures we've had in place, have always been there. I guess it's just that I will say I am working through this myself, and I am thinking through how most productively to have this conversation today during a time when the sort of backlash is strong and when the, sort of sensitivity levels are so high. So unfortunately, I wish I could offer up some wisdom and answers, except to
Um,
say, there are some questions that like, we still need to struggle through as a country.
Mhm.
we certainly do, and I don't know any better than anyone else how to do it, but I do believe very strongly in the notion that you're actually raising up in your essay, which is just one of proximity. And we talk
Mhm.
about being proximate to other neighbors and other communities as a necessary function of justice seeking, and to be able to translate those stories makes it not just abstract. I think part of the great problem that we have in many parts of our public policy right now is a sense of fear against the abstract, the invasion of people of our nation, which is very loaded language and it's just not true, right? But when you think about the sense of invasion, um, and then the ability of people at the highest levels to blame every societal ill on the
Mhm.
so-called invasion creates
Mhm.
just such a sense of anxiety, and it becomes a rhetorical question that's very hard to bat down. The vice president this week and last week has been blaming home prices on,
Mhm.
billions of undocumented immigrants, and it's a very curious argument to me. On one hand, there's a sense that all of these people are just leeching off of the system, and they're not paying taxes, and they're taking these low wage jobs, and they're undermining American society. And on the other hand, can get a really competitive 30-year loan from a bank. I mean, like,
Mhm.
to take a
Mhm.
house, and those things just don't hold water, but they're all deeply ingrained in a sense of fear, of losing what it means to be American, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so interesting, I guess, how, again, I keep saying interesting, and I'm really using that as a euphemism for all kinds of other emotions, but fear and hate have been such powerful political tools throughout human history, not just the United States, but in, various other contexts. And so um, it's definitely chilling and disheartening, I guess, and to be more honest, to see how effective it has been um, here in the United States.
Mm. Yeah, and I have a personal question for you. We talk about this notion, and you brought this up a little bit earlier in our conversation.
Hmm.
We think about this othering, and when does someone fully become
Hmm.
feeling that sense of self, and
Hmm.
I am American, I am one of you. When did you come to that conclusion that I am American? This is my home. I am one of you. Was that a journey? Was that challenging, particularly thinking about your academic work and the things that you're exposed to, and maybe even various attitudes towards you that may be different than others because of your credentialization or not?
Yeah. You know what's so interesting is like, I don't know that I ever really doubted that.
Mhm.
Like, I was born in the United States. I have this tremendous privilege that comes with that. And so actually, I had this kind of, it was more like this fascination that like other people seemed to, or sort of like external circumstances didn't quite jive with that. I think also like, potentially like not, having English be my first and like pretty much only language, um, solidified that. Yeah, I think it's also, we all, when you come, you sort of come of age or you go through education during a time where there's, like increasingly maybe more language to name what is happening that parallel your experiences, and that helps. I know, like, gosh, like, critical race theory, for example, has been so deeply maligned in the public um, discourse. But I remember reading critical race theory in college. I remember reading Murray Matsuda in college and just kind of like saying, oh, yeah, I just kind of like feeling very personally affirmed and encouraged, and saw like the path for me in law through that type of work, through the scholars. We're all, it's kind of, it's very cheesy. We're all standing on other people's shoulders all the time. So I very much feel that. I guess in terms of like, what I'm saying, in terms, how do we speak into this moment? How do we be honest without watering down, but also addressing where we are? Maybe it's that we have yet to fully develop a language that works for where we are. Maybe it's that that language already exists in the work of others who have, kind of journeyed through the transitions from democracy into authoritarianism and who have, you know, um, labored and advocated under repressive regimes in the past. So, you know.
If I may turn us to a concept that I'd really like for you to explore. This is from the beginning of our conversation, but I think it's an interesting turn here. Your paper that you discussed includes this concept of a right to redemption.
Mhm.
In all of this, as people of faith and conscience and goodwill, like we want to believe in redemption, that
Mhm.
it's possible. This is a very positive, virtuous thing. Lawyer to lawyer, you're talking about a right to redemption, which that leads us to think in terms of human rights, civil rights, a legally protected right or a legally advanced right. Please explain a little bit what you mean by a right to redemption, and not just as a virtue, but how that would work in the law or policy.
Sure. I mean, I think the way that we're presenting it is as a soft idea and as a principle that might take some shape in law. I think a lot of times when we think about rights, we think about things that people um, are entitled to demand, and it therefore causes a very negative reaction. And, one thing I've sort of thought about is, whether so there are downsides to framing things as rights because of that. With redemption in particular, if it's, kind of this personal, almost sacred experience, like how do you map that onto law? So maybe what it is more like a right to the possibility of redemption, a place for law to allow and facilitate redemption to occur. And that is a good thing, right? It's not that redemption needs to kind of like entrench itself into law and develop into its own doctrine, um, but that law has a role to play. So, for example, like when you know, when you tell somebody, um, you have done all these things and the state has determined that it doesn't make sense to incarcerate you any longer, but let's go and incarcerate you again, and now let's deport you. When the state says to somebody, and this is something that a point that my co-author makes, when the state says, well, really, what you deserve is to be, cast out. Um, Even though the family and community that you have here is part of your redemption journey, then the law is playing a role in the person's capacity to pursue redemption personally, but also the law is speaking to that person, right? The state has a voice that speaks, and the state, and through law, is capable of telling people, they are condemned. They are worthy. They are members or not members, right? They are in the inside or the outside. And that's not just immigration, that's like in different ways as well. So I think that's what we're trying to get at in terms of like the vocabulary of a a right. I'll think about whether maybe that's not the maybe that's not the word we ultimately settle on.
It's really really interesting to me because I've been thinking and writing a little bit about this quite a lot in the last few weeks. The idea that the coercive state can be really really good at vengeance, and if
Mhm.
it could be really good at vengeance, could it not be
Mhm.
just as good at
Yeah,
mercy?
yeah.
If we can be really really good at exclusion, could we
Mhm.
not be equally committed to inclusion? If we're profoundly committed to profit, could we not also be profoundly committed to charity? And I think these are just fundamentally choices that we make. I'm not trying to workshop your paper for you, but I think it does create. I like that you talk about it in a term of right to redemption, because we talk about corrections, we talk about rehabilitation, we talk about restoration, we talk about all these things, but really what we're really really good at is inflicting pain and punishment. But if we made it a policy provision that we want to redeem someone, I think we would make policies accordingly. I
Mm,
don't know what those always look like, but it could be good.
Yeah, I mean, to the extent that law is an expression of our values as a society, it kind of tells us where we are as a society now. And there are a lot of amazing things about where we are, I guess. There's a lot of good to point to in this country. But there are, like things we need to reckon with still.
Yeah.
And again, not just immigration in various areas as well.
You got me thinking. And for those of you who are just joining, this is Race Matters, and we're here with Professor Jennifer Cole, law professor, legal scholar at Pepperdine University. And, I got to ask you this question just listening to you here, my friend. In thinking about your fate for humanity moving forward in the future, and most people, I'm just going to warn you, they hate when I ask this question, so I'm going to throw it at you anyway.
Hmm.
Are you optimistic as we wrestle with this? Are you pessimistic? Are you hopeful? I mean, how do you glean the future of this narrative where things just seem very dark and we're kind of drowning in it
Mhm.
this day moving forward?
You know, I guess at the end of the day, if I had to choose, I'm going to choose optimism.
All right.
But I think to be optimistic requires just an acknowledgement of um, like the harm of the moment that we're in now, right? Because there is a lot that's happening that is destructive and troublesome. And I mean, as I said, right, we are a lot of, and I'm not the only one to say this, like lots and lots of people have commented that objectively speaking, as a country, we are moving from democracy into authoritarianism. Like I don't actually mean that as a provocative, controversial thing. I'm just sort of like stating it. But I guess, and I don't know if you had said the word faith or not, or if I had been misheard for something else, but like I do actually, as a Christian, believe that God is at work in our midst and that he will bring out something better. Because I think amidst where we see sort of like some of the institutions that we had previously been trusting in, we are seeing new institutions arise. We are seeing, I mean, for example, like, I know there is a lot to be. Um, the American church has expressed itself in a lot of different ways. But I think one can look around and see faith communities stepping in um, alongside those who are vulnerable in our midst in ways that those communities had not before. I think people are potentially asking questions that hadn't been asked before. I do actually think at the end of the day that, sort of out of injustice, beauty can rise. Um, Maybe that's just my optimism, right? Maybe that's just me clinging desperately to the promises of God. But I don't actually think it is. Like, I actually do think it's like born out in the experience of the cross and the promises and the hope. And like, and again, also, it's not to be like everything's going to be wonderful, but I do think one day we are um, headed towards something better.
Well,
Again, I don't really have a whole lot of evidence and proof of that.
faith and hope, my friend.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Redemption.
yeah,
Redemption.
Redemption. Redemption.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, I think our time is up. Thank you very much, Professor Coe. It's very good to see you for joining Eddie Carson and I here on Race Matters, and we are grateful for your work and your voice in the world.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your voices and the work that you are all doing and the dialogue you're creating in this podcast. It's really wonderful.
Thank you, my friend. You be well. Enjoy California.
Thank you.